Incidentally, pollination in a majority of plants is aided by biotic pollinating agents, which get attracted by flowers which vary from each other to attract their specific pollinator. Insect-pollinated flowers, for instance, are usually large and fragrant. However, if they are small, they are bunched together in an inflorescence to make them conspicuous. Moreover, these flowers produce pollen grains as well as large quantities of nectar to reward the agents. When a pollinating agent comes in contact with the anther, its body gets covered in a coat of sticky pollen grains. When the agent sits on another flower to suck the nectar, the pollen present on their bodies comes into contact with the stigma, thus completing the process of pollination. Conversely, flowers pollinated by butterflies are usually lightly scented and brightly colored, with nectar not very deeply hidden, while those pollinated by beetles and flies secrete a rotten odor. Flowers pollinated by birds, on the other hand, have large, odorless, orange or red tubes which are rich in honey. Certain plants attract pollinating insects by offering them shelter. For instance, Amorphophallus, a 6-foot-tall flower, attracts pollinating insects by offering them a safe haven to lay their eggs. In the Yucca plant, on the other hand, a female moth transfers the pollen of another flower to the stigma and simultaneously deposit her eggs in the locule of the flower's ovary. The larvae, which hatch out of the eggs, start consuming some of the developing seeds, while leaving enough of them to propagate the plant. Thus, both the moth and the plant are dependent on each other for the completion of their respective life cycles. However, certain birds and insects such as the bumblebee visit flowers for nectar and pollen, but don't bring about pollination. These creatures are referred to as pollen robbers. Honeybees, as well as other insects, also pollinate a large number of aquatic flowering plants, such as the freshwater lily. However, in certain freshwater plants such as Vallisneria and Hydrilla, and marine seagrasses such as Zostera, pollination occurs by water. This is also known as hydrophily. In Vallisneria, for example, the female plant produces a long-stalked female flower that reaches the surface of the water. The male plant, on the other hand, remains submerged in water, where it produces several tiny floral buds. Upon maturing, the buds rise to the water's surface and open up to expose the anthers. Pollen released from the anthers is carried by water currents, where some of them eventually come in contact with the stigma. In the case of Zostera, a dioecious seagrass, the male and female flowers remain submerged in water. The male flowers produce long and ribbon-like pollen grains which have a mucilaginous covering that protects them from getting wet. The pollen released in water is carried by water currents towards the submerged stigma, and thus pollination is completed. Surprisingly, in aquatic plants, wind pollination, also called anemophilly, is more widespread than water pollination. Wind pollination also occurs in terrestrial plants such as grass, bamboo, coconut, and maize. These plants possess a compact inflorescence with well-exposed stamens that allow easy dispersal of pollen, and a large feathery pistil which makes it easy to trap pollen. The pollen, which is light and non-sticky, is produced in large quantities. A single flower of cannabis, for instance, produces 5 lakh pollen grains to compensate the loss of pollen associated with wind pollination. Thus, wind, water, as well as biotic pollinating agents bring about pollination. An important process that ultimately leads to fertilization and the production of seeds in plants. In flowering plants, pollination is an important mechanism that aids in transferring the pollen released from the anther to the stigma of the flower. If the pollen is of the right type, the stigma induces it to germinate and produce a pollen tube. The pollen tube, containing the 2 male gametes, then secretes hydrolytic enzymes which help the pollen tube to digest the tissues of the style as it travels down to enter the ovule through the micropyle, a minute opening in the ovule. Inside the ovule, the pollen tube encounters the embryo sac, the female gametophyte containing 3 antipetals, 2 synergids, an egg cell, and a central cell with 2 polar nuclei.